You know, normally when you see the word perfection, if you're an astro techie, you think, oh, I'm immediately talking about horary astrology, because horary astrologers use the term perfection all the time. It's part of one of our major tools, which is telling whether or not whatever is being asked about will come to fruition. And one of the most common ways that that happens is through perfection. The most common perfection is when you have an approaching aspect between, as they say in horary, two significators. But there are other kinds of perfections as well, things like translation of light, where the moon separates from one and goes to the other. So various types of perfection, very common in horary. But what is interesting is that actually in the books on horary astrology and in the books on astrology in general, such as books called introductions, the section on perfection is actually discussed in the section that's called general astrology, not the section on horary. Now, in these books, such as Bonatti's book, these general items appear in the text before you ever get to a section on horary. And in a book like Bonatti's, the horary, is one relatively small section of the book, and most of the rest of it is devoted to nativities. So this had always been kind of a question for me, because here you have something that is just vital in horary, is equally vital in doing electional astrology or in doing and interpreting mundane charts, but it's never talked about in natal. So what is this? Why are they presenting it in a section that general astrology was basically those techniques like the nature of the houses, the nature of the signs, the nature of the planets, those things that are supposed to apply to all branches of astrology. So it's like if we're going to be looking at natal astrology, why aren't we doing this whole system? So my question here is, what were our progenitors thinking? And you can kind of intimate from this that we don't have a full-on discussion of this in the classical material. There's kind of dancing around it. So we're going to try to do a little more than dance today. Next slide. Now, this is a translation of Bonatti that was done by Robert Zoller, but Mashallah said that from the place where a planet projects its own rays upon a planet, it is called joined to it, which is true unless another planet prohibits their conjunction. Henceforth, one planet is joined with another, and thence the effects of things are signified. Wherefore, from one planet projects his own rays upon the rays of another, and it stands apart from that planet as much as the orbs of both. It is said that the one planet seeks the conjunction of the other, and it signifies the accomplishment of the sought for thing, unless another planet destroys or impedes. Now, this sounds a little more technical than a normal discussion of one planet aspecting another, but this is nonetheless recognizable as talking about an approaching aspect. And he's using the term perfection, and he's also talking about the idea of prohibition, which is very much a topic which, if you studied horary, you'll recognize right away. So we see here the idea of perfection by aspect. Next slide. Now, one of the things about, if you're talking about approaching and separating, we have to deal with the issue of orbs. And I realize many of you are not by nature necessarily classical astrologers. And even if you are classical astrologers, there are a couple different ways to compute orbs. The modern ways typically fall into one of two camps. There's the camp that does a harmonic idea, and this was something that was introduced a couple decades ago. And I use the term harmonic very deliberately here because that actually describes the situation. The idea was this: the conjunction, which is always maybe an aspect, but maybe not an aspect, because as you saw in that last slide, in some of the ancient materials, the word conjunction actually also applies to aspects. But then there was also the question of whether the conjunction, meaning the zero aspect, really was separate. But the idea is you have one conjunction and you have one opposition. But for all the other aspects, you have two of them. Because, for example, the trine, you have the 120 trine and you have the 240 trine. And so with that idea in mind, there was also the idea that, well, maybe what you do is you reduce orbs basically according to the size of the aspect itself. So the conjunction and opposition would have the largest orbs, and then you'd work down according to the size of the next would be the trine, and then the square, and then the sextiles. And I'm just giving the Ptolemaic aspects, and if you use other aspects, fine as far as this orb system is concerned, but we'll be talking today only about the Ptolemaic aspects. The other way that aspects were frequently set up is to recognize that pretty much everybody gives the sun and the moon more power than any other bodies. So it's also common to give the sun and the moon a large orb and then say, okay, and everybody else gets this. What you have here on the right of this slide is an example that my good colleague Deb Holding produced for the STA course on horary, which is the traditional orbs of the planets. Now, there's a little bit of variation in sources on this, but this would be the orb before the aspect, meaning the approaching aspect, and the orb after. And again, some sources also varied on that as to whether the orb following the exact aspect was exactly the same. What you see in this diagram is the size of the orb is dependent on the planets. Here, the sun especially gets the widest orb. It is the day light. Literally, it is the strongest light. And because there was a lot of philosophical discussion about light as referring to orbs as well, the sun gets precedence, therefore, and gets the largest orb. The moon gets an almost as big orb because she reflects the light so beautifully. But then the planets got a lesser one, and you see the more ponderous planets got the biggest orb. And then Venus and then Mars got a little bit more, Mars also being a superior planet. And then the two inferior planets got a slightly smaller orb. There was also a system called moiety, where you would actually find the orb of a planetary pair by taking half of the orb of one and adding to the half orb of the other, moiety being a half orb. So there are a couple of ways this was done. Now, I'm not going to get religious on this today. So again, we'll be talking mainly about the closer aspects because you can illustrate things a little more clearly with that in any case. All right, next slide, please. Now, I have to call this a hypothesis of meaning because we don't have a lot in the way of historical examples to tell us how to do this. Quite honestly, in natal astrology, the major examples you got were actually the books of genitures, where horoscopes were presented. You don't tend to have these really long and descriptive analyses that are printed. You have pieces of analyses, would be a better way to put it. So thinking about these ideas, thinking about the ways that they're described in horary, there's one thing that's very clear. When you talk about this within a horary context, the effect of the aspect is basically in horary, once an aspect is passed, it's still in the area. But when you're looking for a future event, the basic interpretation is that an approaching aspect occurs in the future because it will perfect. The moment that it is exact, and sometimes exactitude is considered to be what's called partile, which is in the degree and sometimes is stretched a little bit. But once you're past partile, you're in the separating phase. And in the separating phase now, separating aspects within a horary are interpreted as events in the past. And so now, if we think about this idea, how are we going to talk about approaching and separating in the nativity? Because any of us who work with charts know that probably every single one of you, and that includes me, have simply interpreted aspects as aspects, and you don't spend too much time thinking about, is this an approaching trine or a separating trine, I'm going to basically say to you today, maybe you should start looking at this because you might get some interesting ideas out of it.